December 7th, 1941. Over Pearl Harbor, the black smoke from burning battleships had yet to clear. But on the decks of the carriers, Japanese sailors were already celebrating the greatest victory in the history of the empire. But in the flagship's cabin, Admiral Yamamoto, the man who planned this strike, did not share the joy. He stared through the porthole at the horizon, feeling not triumph, but a biting cold. In his diary, he would later write words that became a prophecy. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Yamamoto, having studied at Harvard and served in Washington, knew what the fanatical generals in Tokyo did not. He had seen the smoke of the factories in Ohio and the endless oil fields of Texas. He understood that Japan hadn't just struck an enemy, they had struck a foe from a different league. It wasn't a fear of the soldier, it was a fear of industrial logic, a force against which the samurai spirit was powerless. At that time, the Japanese mind was ruled by Yamato-damashii, the indomitable spirit. Tokyo believed Americans were a soft, divided nation of Democrats who would beg for peace after the first crushing blow. It was a fatal delusion. The Navy's fear was built on simple, dry numbers, hidden behind glossy intelligence reports. While Japanese craftsmen were hand-polishing propeller blades for their Zeros, Henry Ford was already retooling assembly lines to churn out bombers. The Japanese understood. They could build one aircraft carrier in 3 years. The Americans, if you made them angry, could launch one every week. This was the mathematical nightmare that haunted Japanese strategists in every dream. By mid-42, after the defeat at Midway, the hidden anxiety turned into paralyzing terror. Japan's elite aces, trained for decades, were dying one by one. And here, the true difference between two armies was revealed. When Japan lost an experienced pilot, he was replaced by a terrified boy with 30 hours of flight time. When America lost a pilot, 10 new ones took his place, trained on modern simulators with a perfect grasp of tactics. The Japanese realized they were fighting a hydra. For every head they cut off, 3 more grew back, and each was more perfect than the last. This was a war of attrition. Methodically, inch by inch, the Americans ground the Japanese machine into the dust, turning the Pacific into a giant graveyard for the Imperial Navy. Another reason for this deep fear was logistics. The Japanese army was an army of necessity. Soldiers were taught to endure hunger, thirst, and a lack of medicine. But the American army was an army of abundance. Japanese scouts on captured islands would find abandoned American rations and fall into a trance. There was chocolate, instant coffee, chewing gum, even high-quality cigarettes. To a Japanese infantryman swallowing a handful of rotten rice in the jungle, this looked like magic. If the enemy can afford to supply millions of soldiers with sweets and fresh laundry on the other side of the planet, then what are his real resources? This realization broke their will faster than machine gun fire. In 43, the fear took a new form: technological superiority. The Japanese took pride in their monster battleships, the Yamato and the Musashi. But the Americans didn't answer with caliber, they answered with radar and electronics. Japanese ships, relying on their eyes, became easy prey for torpedoes and shells guided through the fog and darkness. It was a hunt of the sighted against the blind. The famous Zero fighters, once the invincible demons of the sky, became flying coffins. Behind the American Hellcats wasn't just a powerful engine, there was science. Then came island hopping. The American strategy was brilliant and ruthless. They didn't capture every fortified island, they simply bypassed them, cut their supplies, and left the garrisons to rot. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, trapped on lost dots of land, simply vanished from history. The American fleet became the master of the ocean. Japan, which had conquered half of Asia, was now choking inside its own home. But the most horrific fear came from the sky. When the first B-29 superfortresses appeared, Japan realized there is no defense. These silver birds flew so high the guns couldn't reach them, and the Japanese fighters gasped for air. Firestorms turned paper cities into giant bonfires. But it wasn't just the flames that terrified them, it was the methodology. The Americans would drop leaflets naming the cities they planned to burn the next day. This was the ultimate psychological dominance. The enemy was so confident they warned you of the strike, knowing you were powerless to stop it. It was more than a defeat, it was a public humiliation of the entire empire. In the end, the Japanese did not fear the Americans for their courage. Courage was everywhere. They feared them for their industrial wrath. The Americans fought like engineers building a bridge, calculated, efficient, and with an infinite supply of material. For a nation living on myths and traditions, this soulless, perfect machine was like a natural disaster. You cannot defeat a tsunami with a sword, no matter how sharp the blade. The adaptation, sharp and intense. The inner fear of the Japanese high command wasn't just fed by the power of American factories, but by the enemy's frightening ability to adapt. At the start of the war, the Japanese infantry were masters of the night. They used shock, surprise, and savage bayonet charges that sent green American recruits into a panic. But the triumph didn't last. The Japanese discovered, with horror, that the Americans learned at incredible speed. For every banzai charge, the U.S. Marines answered with a wall of automatic fire and artillery that worked with the precision of a watchmaker. The Japanese spirit, ready for self-sacrifice, slammed into an American wall of lead. They realized their enemy wasn't just brave, he was pragmatic. He didn't seek a glorious death, he sought the most efficient way to delete the obstacle. This pragmatism was in everything. While Japanese soldiers spent months digging fortifications into coral rock by hand, the Americans brought monstrous bulldozers, excavators, and entire floating factories. Japanese officers, watching through binoculars, saw the Americans turn a deserted beach into a modern airfield in days. It was an existential terror. This wasn't a war between two armies, it was a collision between medieval hand labor and the might of the industrial age. While the Japanese garrison prayed for the enemy to run out of supplies, the Americans were building ice cream plants and open-air movie theaters. This contrast between the cult of want and the cult of abundance rotted Japanese confidence from the inside out. The blockade, somber and suffocating. By 1944, the Imperial Fleet, once the master of the sea, had become a ghost fleet. American submarines, armed with the latest sonar, turned Japanese waters into a slaughterhouse. The tankers carrying oil from Indonesia sank by the dozens. Without fuel, planes couldn't fly, ships couldn't sail. Japan, an island nation, began to suffocate. The blockade. The fear of hunger became as real as the fear of bombs. People watched as their great army traded trucks for bicycles, and school children were forced to dig up pine roots, desperately trying to squeeze a single drop of fuel from the earth. In this moment of despair, the kamikaze was born. Propaganda called it the ultimate patriotism, but in reality it was a shriek of terror before the inevitable. The leadership hoped that mass suicide would make the Americans shudder, make them retreat from such fanaticism. They were wrong. The American Navy answered with the most powerful anti-air defense the world had ever seen. The sky turned black with flak. For every U.S. ship hit, the shipyards in Virginia and California launched 3 more. The Japanese realized a terrifying truth. Even their deaths could not stop the assembly line. The breaking point came at Okinawa. The Japanese fought with the rage of the doomed, but they watched as the Americans used flamethrower tanks and napalm, burning out entire caves. This was the Iron Rain. Commanders in Tokyo realized if this power reached the home islands, there would be nothing left of the Japanese nation but ashes. And the ashes came in August 1945. When the mushroom clouds rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Bushido had no answers. The Americans had harnessed the energy of the universe. This wasn't just a bomb, it was an act of a technological god. The Japanese realized the Americans could erase them from the map without ever setting foot on their shore. When the USS Missouri entered Tokyo Bay for the surrender, the Japanese delegation saw the horizon filled with American steel. They didn't see soft Democrats. They saw a nation that had transformed itself into the most powerful machine in human history. Their fear turned into the deep, almost mystical respect for the winner's power. The post-war Japan was built on the wreckage of that fear. They took their discipline and pointed it away from conquest and toward technology. The lesson of 1941 was learned. Never wake the giant unless you are ready for the consequences of his wrath. Today, the shadow of the giant no longer scares them. It serves as a reminder of the price of peace in the age of industrial gods. A nation that once believed in the magic of the past was rebuilt by the reality of the future.